Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we are climbing into the cabs of Alberta long-haul truckers, the ones who spend their lives on frozen highways, forgotten gravel roads, and lightless rest stops where the only witnesses are the trees and the snow. These are not campfire tales. These are the stories whispered over diesel engines and late-night coffee, when drivers talk about the things that followed them down the highway. The voices that should not know their names, the loads that vanished without a trace, and the fellow truckers who left a yard and were simply never seen again. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Alberta highways and truck stops, where civilization ends and terror begins. I have been driving Alberta highways for almost 15 years now, long enough that the white lines and dark spruce blur together into one endless ribbon in my memory. I started out thinking this job was about freedom, about wide open skies and big money, and in some ways, that is still true. But if you run nights on Highway 63 long enough, the stretch between Edmonton and Fort McMurray will teach you that there are places out here where the world feels thin, like something is pressing against the other side, watching. The old-timers used to joke about it when I was a rookie, sitting around Fort McMurray truck stops with their coffee and their bad jokes, warning me not to pull over between certain mile markers unless my bladder was really ready to pay the price. I thought it was hazing. Just another way to spook the new guy. Now, I am not so sure. The run that changed my mind started like any other late November haul, the kind that grinds down into your bones. The weather had done what Alberta weather does best, skipping fall entirely and dropping us straight into a deep freeze. The kind of cold that makes the air feel sharp in your lungs and turns every breath into a little cloud of ghost smoke. I had a loaded flatbed, equipment going north to a site outside Fort Mac. Nothing unusual there. Dispatch had me slotted for an overnight to miss the worst of the traffic, and that was fine with me. Fewer cars meant fewer idiots cutting in front of my bumper to shave 30 seconds off their drive. I rolled out of Edmonton just after 9, the city lights fading behind me in the mirrors as the highway stretched ahead, black and endless. The sky was clear and hard, stars brittle as ice chips scattered all the way to the horizon. The radio was low, some classic rock station fighting for dominance with the hiss of static, and the rhythmic growl of the engine was almost soothing. The first couple of hours passed in that familiar haze of mental autopilot. Check the gauges, scan the mirrors, sip lukewarm coffee, mentally calculate arrival times. The usual. Somewhere north of Grassland, the traffic thinned to almost nothing. Every few minutes, another set of headlights would appear far behind me, crawl closer, then slip into the opposite lane and vanish ahead. Then even that stopped. It was just my truck, the steady hum of the tires on packed snow, and miles of dark forest shouldering up to the highway on both sides. I remember thinking how the trees seemed to lean in a little closer that night, the way they do in bad dreams, their tops lost in the dark. That was when the radio started to act up. It began with a soft crackle that rose and fell under the music, like someone turning a dial somewhere just out of reach. I flicked the radio off, thinking it was the station, but the sound did not stop. A low, distant interference seemed to shiver in the speakers. Not quite voices, not quite anything I could pin down. It faded after a minute, leaving only the thrum of the engine and the faint whistle of wind around the cab. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to atmospheric nonsense. Up here, anything can mess with your electronics. Cold solar flares, some random quirk in the line. You learn not to obsess over every glitch. Then the lights appeared. I caught them first in the corner of my eye, reflected in the side mirror. At a glance, I thought it was just another truck coming up behind me. 2 bright points in the distance, gaining slowly. But as seconds turned into a minute, I realized they were not growing larger, and they were not low to the ground like headlights. Instead, they hung just above the tree line, a pair of white orbs gliding along at a steady pace, matching my speed. I glanced over at the passenger side, expecting to see another vehicle, some kind of wide load or maintenance rig on a parallel service road. There was nothing. Only the dark wall of trees and the thin strip of snowpacked shoulder. I looked back to the mirror. The lights were still there, pinned in place like they were attached to my trailer. My hands tightened on the wheel. I told myself it had to be aircraft, a helicopter maybe, or some low-flying plane on a weird route. Except there was no sound, no rotors, no engine, no rhythmic thump dopplering through the cold night air. Just the steady roar of my own truck and a silence outside that felt heavier than it should. For a while, I pretended it was nothing. I kept my eyes on the road, counted off the mile markers, took another drink of coffee that had gone bitter and cold. But every time I checked my mirrors, the lights were still there, hanging at the same height, the same distance, like they were pacing me. When I slowed slightly, they seemed to drift closer. When I pushed a little more throttle, they matched me again, never gaining, never falling behind. The human brain is good at rationalizing. It is also good at knowing when it is lying to itself. After 10 minutes of this, the rational part of me ran out of excuses. A slow, unpleasant tightness began to creep up my spine. I flipped the CB to scan, hoping to hear another driver mention something, anything. The channels rolled past in a blur of static and occasional chatter, but nobody said a word about strange lights or weird aircraft. If anyone else was out here, they either did not see it or did not want to talk about it. The first real jolt came when my dash cam cut out. 1 second, the little green light on the unit was glowing steady, happily recording every mile in case some idiot four-wheeler decided to make my life difficult. The next, it flickered, went red for a heartbeat, then shut off entirely. No beeps, no error message, just gone. At the same moment, the faint interference in the speakers surged back, louder this time, a wash of whispers that seemed almost on the edge of forming words, too many voices layered on top of each other to separate. I smacked the radio with the heel of my hand, because sometimes the stupid solution works. The whispers cut off as abruptly as they had started. The dash cam light blinked back to life. My heart was thudding a little harder than the situation really deserved. It was just electronics, I told myself. Cold weather, cheap wiring, who knows. I checked the mirror again. The lights had moved. They were no longer behind me. Now they hung in the distance ahead, dead center, in my lane, suspended above the highway like a pair of pale stars, hovering just over the asphalt. They were further away now, maybe half a kilometer in front of the truck, but they were not fading or growing smaller with perspective. They stayed the same size, as if distance did not apply to them the way it should. I felt a strange pressure in my ears then, like the sensation you get when a plane descends too fast, except there had been no change in elevation. The air in the cab seemed heavier. I realized my lower back hurt from tensing against the seat, and that my knuckles were white on the wheel. Something deep inside me, that old animal piece that does not understand technology or physics, whispered that I was being led somewhere, that those lights were not random, that they were waiting. I eased off the accelerator and signaled, even though there was no one to see it, drifting toward the shoulder. The lights ahead seemed to slow with me, staying at that same impossible distance. My stomach turned. Every instinct screamed that stopping right now would be a mistake, that if I pulled over in this particular stretch of nowhere, with no other vehicles in sight and those lights hanging in the sky like twin eyes, something would finally have the chance to come close. So I did the only thing that made sense. I kept driving. The next town with a half-decent truck stop would be another 30 or 40 minutes, if I remembered correctly. A long time to sit with the feeling that something was pacing my rig, like a predator shadowing a herd animal. The lights did not waver. Occasionally they would drift higher, then lower, like they were adjusting position, but they never left my lane. The radio stayed mercifully silent, aside from a faint, occasional hiss that raised the hairs on my arms. At some point, I realized I had stopped checking my phone, stopped fiddling with the climate controls. All of my attention had narrowed down to the strip of road in front of me and the glow in the mirror. The outside world shrank to that tunnel of headlights, the windows on either side showing only dark trees racing past like black bars. Time got slippery. I could not have said whether 10 minutes had passed or an hour. When the sign for the upcoming rest area finally appeared out of the dark, it felt like coming up for air. I did not care that it was one of those bare-bones spots with a couple of washrooms and some dim floodlights. It meant people, or at least the possibility of them. It meant a break from the feeling of being alone with whatever this was. As I approached the exit, the lights ahead rose, drifting up and away from the highway until they were just 2 distant points against the sky. Then nothing at all. One blink, and they were gone. The pressure in my ears eased. The cab felt bigger suddenly, less claustrophobic. I signaled and pulled off, rolling into the rest area lot, with my pulse still hammering in my throat. There were 2 other trucks parked there, their cabs dark, their drivers likely asleep. Sodium lights cast a sickly orange glow over the snow-packed asphalt. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, hand still on the wheel, listening to the sudden quiet as the rumble died. Without the engine noise, the world outside seemed incredibly still. No wind, no distant traffic, just the faint tick of cooling metal from the hood. Eventually, curiosity beat out dread. I unbuckled, reached up to the dash cam, and popped the memory card. If I had imagined all of this, the footage would prove it. If I had not, then at least I would have something to show other people, something tangible. I pulled my laptop from behind the seat, booted it up, and slid the card into the reader. The files were there, neatly time-stamped one after another. I opened the first clip from the period when I remembered seeing the lights in my mirrors. For the first few minutes, everything looked normal. Snowy highway, yellow center lines, my headlights carving a white tunnel through the dark. Then the image froze. Not like a simple pause, more like the frame itself had been smeared. The colors warped, stretching toward the top of the screen in jagged streaks, while pixelated shapes danced around the edges. The timestamp continued to tick, but the video did not move for almost 30 seconds. When it finally jumped forward, it was several kilometers later. No lights, no sky, just asphalt. I clicked through to another file, one from when the lights had moved ahead of me. In the still frame just before another corruption block, there was a brief, grainy glimpse of my own truck from above, as if the camera had lifted out through the windshield and was looking down on the cab and trailer from the sky. It lasted less than a second, there and gone, but it was enough. That angle was impossible, not unless a second camera had been hovering 50 meters above my rig. I sat there in the glow of the laptop screen, feeling the hairs rise on the back of my neck. Outside, the rest area remained quiet, the other trucks motionless silhouettes under the lights. I wanted to believe this was some glitch, some bizarre software hiccup that just happened to coincide with a weird visual illusion. I wanted to, but the part of me that had grown up under these skies, that had heard the old stories about lights over the muskeg and strange things seen from lonely cabs at 3 a.m, knew better. By the time I reached Fort McMurray the next day, the whole experience had already started to feel like something half-remembered from a nightmare. The rational mind works hard to file down the edges of these things, but when I mentioned it quietly to a couple of veteran drivers over coffee, expecting laughter or a lecture about getting more sleep, they did not laugh. They shared a look I recognized immediately, that silent acknowledgement between people who have seen the same unpleasant thing. One of them asked, very casually, which section of 63 it had been. When I told him, he nodded slowly and stirred his coffee, staring at the swirl of cream like he expected an answer to rise out of it. Another just said that it was smart I had not pulled over out there. Then the conversation drifted to other topics, as if we had not brushed up against something no one really wanted to name. I still drive that highway. This is my livelihood. and there are not many routes up here that do not carry their own ghosts. But I plan my overnights differently now. I give that stretch more respect than I used to. I keep my dash cam running, and whenever the radio crackles with that soft, layered hiss, I reach over and turn the volume all the way down. On clear winter nights, when the stars are too bright and the forest seems to lean in toward the road, I do not look too long at the mirrors. Some things on 63 seem curious when you notice them. Some things seem to like it when you look back. The first time I heard about the woman in the ditch, it sounded like just another road story. Every job has its favorite ghosts, and truckers are no different. I was still new to the Calgary to Lethbridge route back then, still figuring out which highway diners had decent coffee and which scales you could expect surprise inspections at. On dead stretches of road, the radio becomes a kind of campfire, and the stories that flicker across it are half warning, half entertainment. That night, some of the old hands were trading tales about near misses with deer, black ice patches, and then one of them mentioned her. "Watch south of Okotoks after midnight," a gravelly voice said over the CB, casual but with just enough weight to make me glance at the clock. "Left side ditch. You will see her if you run it long enough." Somebody else laughed and asked if she was hitchhiking or just haunting. The first driver said she did not move, did not wave, did not look at you, just stood ankle deep in the snow staring toward the highway like she was waiting for someone who never came. The channel filled with static and jokes after that, a few more guys chiming in with their own versions, but the description stuck with me. Woman in a white parka, dark hair, always there after midnight when the fog rolls in. It was the kind of story that lodges in your brain whether you believe it or not. I told myself it was probably some regular pedestrian, maybe a mentally ill local who liked to walk at night, and the truckers had turned her into a legend because it made the miles pass faster. I did not think about it again until the night I saw her. It was late January, the kind of cold that makes road salt useless and glass feel brittle. I had a trailer full of grocery pallets heading south, the sky low and heavy, with the promise of more snow. The earlier part of the run had not been bad. There was enough traffic that the world still felt inhabited, but by the time I left Okotoks behind, the highway had emptied out. The town shrank into small clusters of distant lights, and the darkness in between grew longer and thicker. Fog rolled in fast, the way it sometimes does on the prairies, curling up from the ditches and flattening across the road in slow-moving sheets. My high beams turned it into a glowing wall, so I kept them off, relying on the regular beams and the faint reflection from the center line. The world narrowed down to that pale stripe and the occasional ghost of a fence post or stand of trees. I had almost forgotten about the story when my headlights swept over her. She was standing in the left side ditch, just beyond the median, where the snow dipped down and disappeared into shadow. For a second, I thought I was looking at a road sign or some kind of marker, something tall and pale at the edge of my peripheral vision. Then the shape resolved as I drew closer. A woman. White parka zipped up to her chin, fur-trimmed hood down around her shoulders despite the cold. Dark hair hanging straight, not blowing in the wind because there was no wind. Her arms were at her sides, fingers bare and slightly curled. She was not facing the road exactly, not looking at my truck. Instead, she stared a little to the right, like she was focused on an invisible point a few meters out on the asphalt. My body reacted before my brain did. My foot shifted toward the brake. My hands tightened on the wheel. A flash of questions jolted through me. Is she hurt? Is this a setup? Is someone waiting just beyond the fog? Years of safety briefings and warnings about roadside scams clashed with a basic instinct not to leave a person out in that kind of cold. The moment stretched thin as I passed her. From my elevated seat, I should have been able to see her face clearly, but what I remember most is an impression of stillness. No shivering, no shifting, no acknowledgement of 20 tons of truck thundering past. It was like driving past a photograph. Then she was gone, swallowed by the fog in the mirror. The highway around me remained empty. No other vehicles. No parked car she might have come from. No emergency flashers hidden in the mist. Just my own taillights painting the fog red. My heart hammered for a few miles afterward. I argued with myself in circles. I should have stopped. I should have called someone. I should have turned around. But turning a loaded rig on a narrow highway in bad visibility is not a simple decision. By the time I convinced myself to at least report a possible pedestrian on the road, I was too far for any quick turnaround, and the cold logic of distance had already started dulling the urgency. At the next fuel stop, I told the clerk about it as casually as I could, pretending I expected her to say it was just some local woman who always walked at night. Instead, she gave me a long, searching look and asked what she had been wearing. When I said white parka, the clerk nodded once, slow, like I had confirmed something she would rather not think about. "You're not the first," she said quietly as she rang up my coffee. "Happens every winter. Same spot. Same description. Cops go out sometimes. Do not find anyone. They say it is just people seeing things in the fog." She slid me my receipt and added, almost under her breath, "But my uncle hit a woman there in the 80s. White coat. She did not make it to the hospital." The rest of the shift, that conversation nagged at the back of my mind. By the time I got home and crawled into bed, exhaustion swallowed most of it. Trucking will do that to you. You can see a moose explode across the grill one night and be worrying about dispatch times the next morning. Survival of the job requires you to keep moving. Weeks went by. I ran that route again and again. Sometimes the fog was there, sometimes the sky was clear. I looked at the left side ditch more than I used to, but I did not see her again. A part of me began to believe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe some weird play of fog and snow and a fence post. The mind sees patterns in noise. That is what it does. Then spring came and went, the ditches turning from white to brown to green. The story settled into the mental drawer where I keep all the other oddities of the road. Unusual, but survivable. Explainable, if I pressed hard enough. It was late fall when she returned. This time there was no fog, just a clear, cold night, and a hard frost glittering along the shoulder. I had left Calgary later than planned, delayed by a warehouse mix-up that had cost me an hour. The sky was sharp with stars. The half-moon hanging low and yellow over the distant fields. My headlights carved a clean path ahead, the reflective paint on the lines almost painfully bright. I saw her again near the same stretch, though I could not have pointed to the exact kilometer. It was just that feeling, that subtle tightening in my gut as the low hills and curve of the road matched a memory I had not consciously kept track of. I glanced toward the left ditch out of habit more than anything. She was there, not standing this time, but closer to the slope, her boots buried halfway in a thin crust of snow, arms still at her sides. The white parka looked older now, or maybe that was my imagination. As my rig approached, something in her posture seemed to have changed. Her head was angled a little more in my direction, not enough to call it staring. Just off by a few degrees, a tiny adjustment, a step closer to the road. I told myself it could not be the same woman. People own white coats. People walk at night. That is reality. But the hair at my nape prickled all the same. The way she held herself. The way she did not react as tons of steel and noise rushed past. The way the air around her seemed somehow thinner, like the world was less solid at that point, shook me more than I wanted to admit. This time I did not even reach for the brakes. Something about the scene felt wrong in a way I did not have words for. Like the moment before you open a door, you suddenly know you should not. Instead, I drove on, fingers drumming a tense rhythm on the wheel, telling myself I would bring it up on the radio. When I did, the channel went quiet for a few seconds, which is rare on that corridor. Then one of the older voices I had come to recognize came on low and steady. "You saw her again, did you?" he asked, like we were continuing a conversation instead of starting one. I hesitated, then admitted that I had. The channel crackled softly. Another driver asked if she had been closer to the shoulder this time. The way he phrased it made my stomach drop. I told them what I had noticed. No one laughed or called me crazy. Instead, a third voice, older and rougher, said he had been running that route since before I was born, and every few years someone new saw her. Always in the same rough area, always in winter, always moving a little closer to the road each time. "That is why I keep right through there," he said, only half joking. You never know when someone will step out without looking. After that, I could not quite file it away anymore. The logical explanations still existed, sure, but they did not settle the way they used to. Curiosity got the better of me eventually. On a layover day in Calgary, I ended up at a corner table of a small coffee shop, scrolling through local archives on my phone. It took a while. The internet never forgets, but it also rarely presents what you need neatly labeled. I found a short article from the late 80s about a woman killed along that corridor, struck by a truck in the early hours of the morning. The grainy black and white photo showed a smiling face framed by dark hair, a white parka collar visible at the edge of the image. The details matched what the clerk had said months before. Single vehicle, poor visibility, icy road. The driver was not charged. They called it a tragic accident. The article noted that she had been walking away from a broken-down car when it happened. There were no follow-up stories, no memorial pages, just that brief, factual piece and a life reduced to a few sentences. I stared at the picture longer than I meant to. The way her eyes met the camera, alive and unaware of what the future would bring, made my chest tighten. From then on, that stretch of road was never just another few miles to chew through. Even on clear nights, I felt my hands tense on the wheel as I approached it. I started keeping my rig firmly to the right side of the lane, giving the left ditch a wider berth than strictly necessary. I tried not to look, but sometimes instinct wins. Every so often, especially when frost silvered the ground and the sky was low, I thought I saw a pale shape in the corner of my vision. Never clear, never enough to be sure. Just an impression, like a memory replaying on the edge of sight. Other drivers had their own variations. Some swore they had seen her closer to the guardrail, head turned more toward the road. One said he had glimpsed her in his mirror instead of ahead, standing in the same patch of ditch as he passed, even though there had been nothing there when he looked forward. One younger guy claimed he saw her raise one arm, as if to wave or reach out, but nobody on the channel seemed eager to confirm that detail. People asked why I did not report it again. The truth is, I did once, in a general sort of way. I mentioned to an officer at a scale that there might be pedestrians out there at night. He wrote it down, thanked me, and that was that. What else could I say? There is a woman in a white parka who might have died 30 years ago and is now creeping closer to the shoulder with every winter. Even if I believed it entirely, there is no checkbox for that on a form. So I did the only thing that felt sensible. I adjusted. I treated that stretch like a permanent hazard. My speed nudged down a few kilometers per hour. My attention sharpened. My lane position shifted right. I did not rubberneck, did not stare into the ditch trying to force a sighting. Road work has taught me that looking too long at the wrong thing is how accidents happen. But even when I kept my eyes locked on the center line, I could feel that patch of highway when I was in it. The air seemed just a little colder. The hum of the tires changed tone, maybe from a different kind of pavement, maybe from something else. On some nights, I could swear the steering wheel seemed to want to drift gently left there, like some subtle camber in the road was nudging me toward the shoulder. I checked alignments, had the mechanics look things over. Everything came back clean. These days, if someone new keys up on the CB and starts joking about the woman in the ditch, I do not laugh. I do not tell them what to believe. I just say to keep an eye on their lane through that sector and to take the fog seriously. It is easy to dismiss stories until you are alone on the highway at 2 a.m. and your headlights pick out a figure that should not be there, standing too still in the freezing dark. Maybe she is just a legend now, built from fear and repetition. Maybe every sighting is a different person who has nothing to do with that old article and that old collision. But every time I pass that stretch, I think about a broken down car decades ago. A woman walking along a winter road, trusting that the drivers coming toward her would see her in time. I think about how quickly a life turned into a story we tell to pass the hours. And I keep my rig to the right, eyes forward, resisting the urge to look. Because, whether she is really there or not, some part of me is certain that one of these winters she will finally step up out of the ditch and onto the asphalt. And whoever happens to be coming around that bend will not have enough road left to stop. I used to joke that I liked driving nights because at least the only thing in the sleeper was my own bad dreams. You spend enough years running solo from Vancouver to Edmonton, and you get used to a certain kind of loneliness, the kind that feels almost peaceful. The cab becomes your whole world. You get to know every rattle, every draft of cold air, every tiny noise the truck makes when it settles after you kill the engine. That familiarity was what made it so unnerving when the sounds changed, when something new started moving in the dark behind me. It began on a Tuesday in late February, halfway through a week of back-to-back runs that had turned my sleep schedule inside out. I had left Edmonton after sunset, the sky already a bruised purple smear over the fields, headed west toward Jasper before dropping into British Columbia. The snowbanks along the highway were high and crusted, the kind that turned exits into narrow tunnels and made everything feel closer. The radio was low, more for company than entertainment, and a to-go cup of bitter coffee sweated in the holder. By the time I hit the foothills, fatigue had wrapped itself around my shoulders like a heavy blanket. I was not nodding off, nothing that dangerous, but the edges of things were starting to blur. Signs seemed to jump out of the dark a little faster. My mind drifted more between gear changes. I told myself I would push another hour, then find a safe spot to park, grab 4 or 5 hours in the sleeper, and finish the trip in the morning. I had done that dance 100 times. There is a pull-off I like just east of the park boundary. Nothing more than a widened shoulder and a basic rest area with a couple of outhouses and a garbage bin. But it is far enough from the main towns that it tends to stay quiet. No kids revving their cars, no drunks, just the occasional other trucker who wants a few hours of unbothered sleep. That night, it was empty when I rolled in. My headlights washed over a blank expanse of snow and the dark shapes of spruce trees crowding the edge of the lot. No other rigs, no idling engines, just my own reflection in the mirror for company. I set the brakes, did the usual quick walk around out of habit, breath fogging in the sharp air, then climbed back into the cab and shut everything down. The sudden drop in noise is always jarring. 1 minute the engine is a living thing under you. The next there is just the faint tick of metal cooling and the low rush of wind outside. I pulled the curtain between the windshield and the sleeper, kicked off my boots, and crawled into the bunk fully dressed, too tired to bother with anything else. The sleeper smelled like it always did, a mix of fabric, cold air, and the lingering trace of my aftershave. I lay on my side facing the narrow window, watching a thin line of orange from the parking lot light bleed around the edges of the shade. My body ached in that satisfying way that promised sleep would come quick. For a while, nothing existed but the small sounds of the truck settling. A soft creak here, a faint pop of contracting metal there, the occasional rattle from something in a cabinet I had not wedged properly. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was the sensation of weight shifting in the bunk behind my knees. It was subtle, like someone had leaned a hand on the mattress to steady themselves. A slight dip that pressed against my legs, then eased off. My eyes snapped open. For a moment, I lay absolutely still, heart hammering against my ribs, mind scrambling for a rational explanation. Trucks move. Airbags release tiny amounts of pressure. Temperatures change. All of that can cause small shifts. I knew this. I'd told other drivers the same thing when they mentioned weird creaks keeping them up at night. Then I heard the breathing, It was faint, almost lost under the soft whine of wind, but it was there, inches from the back of my neck. Slow, measured inhales and exhales, not quite matching my own rhythm. Too close to be coming from outside, too human to be anything mechanical. The air on my skin felt subtly different, cooler in a way that suggested displacement, like there was another body in the tight space of the sleeper, altering the way the warmth circulated. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to sit up, to grab the flashlight I kept tucked under the pillow. Instead, I lay frozen, palms damp against the sheet. The rational part of my mind tried to frame it as some kind of half-dream. I'd been on the edge of sleep after all. People wake up from nightmares, convinced there is someone in the room all the time. The problem was that nightmares usually fade. This did not. The breathing continued steady and indifferent to my awareness. The weight on the mattress shifted again. A slow, deliberate movement. Like whoever shared the bunk with me was changing position. I felt the faint drag of fabric against my calf, as if a knee had brushed it through the blankets. That jolted me out of paralysis. I rolled over fast and hit the switch for the interior light in the same motion, heart pounding high in my throat. The sleeper flooded with weak yellow light. The narrow bunk, the overhead compartments, the little shelf with my charger and paperback, all exactly as they should be. No one else. No disturbed blankets except for the ones I was wrapped in. No indentation beside me that would suggest another weight. My breath sawed in and out, loud in the sudden brightness, and for a long moment, that was the only sound. I told myself it was exhaustion, microdreams, a hypnagogic hallucination, the kind you read about in articles shared by guys who think they are part-time neuroscientists. That explanation fit, more or less. So I clung to it. I left the light on, even though it made sleep harder, and eventually the adrenaline ebbed enough that my eyes closed again. When my alarm buzzed 3 hours later, I woke feeling wrung out and brittle. The night's weirdness had already begun to feel distant, like something my mind had exaggerated. I shoved it aside, went through the motions of starting the truck, did my checks, and rolled back onto the highway. There was no time to dwell. Freight did not care about ghosts, real or imagined. Except the next night, it happened again. Different route, this time. I had turned the rig around in Vancouver, swapped loads, and was heading back east, making it just past Kamloops before the familiar fuzz of fatigue crept in at the edges of my vision. I pulled into a proper truck stop, full of rigs lined up like sleeping animals, sodium lights buzzing overhead. It felt safer somehow to be surrounded by other drivers. Less room for the imagination to get cute. The pattern repeated itself, down to the smallest detail. I settled in, killed the main lights, lay down. The sounds of the lot filtered faintly through the cab walls. Distant laughter, a door slamming, the low cough of idling engines. At some point, I drifted off. I woke to the feeling of someone sitting at the very edge of the bunk, near my feet. The mattress dipped more noticeably this time, a slow compression that rolled my body slightly toward the rear wall. The weight was wrong for a dropped item or a shift in the truck's suspension. It felt measured, careful, like whoever it was did not want to jostle me awake, except I was awake. Every nerve lit up, muscles rigid under the blanket. The thick silence of the cab pressed against my ears. The lot outside had quieted. Most of the other engines were off, the occasional distant rumble blending into a low background hum. I listened, waiting for the breathing, but all I could hear was my own pulse pounding. Very slowly, the pressure on the mattress eased, as if someone had stood up. A soft sound followed, almost inaudible but unmistakable once I focused on it. The whisper of bare feet on the narrow strip of floor between the bunk and the driver's seat. A careful, unhurried step or two. Then nothing. I did not turn on the light immediately. Some part of me understood that the act of flipping that switch would make the moment real in a way I did not want it to be. Instead, I snapped, "Who is there?" Into the dark, my voice harsh in the confined space. It sounded ridiculous, bravado layered over fear. No one answered. The quiet pressed in. When I finally reached for the light, the sleeper looked exactly as mundane as it had the night before. No open door. No signs of forced entry. The curtain to the cab was still partly drawn, the way I'd left it. The outside locks were engaged. I checked them twice, then a third time, stepping down into the icy lot in my socks like an idiot just to be sure. The truck stop around me was as ordinary as ever. No shadowy figures lingered between the trailers. Nothing moved that should not. Drivers talk about paranoia. About being alone so much that every little sound becomes a threat. I considered that. Maybe the accumulated isolation and weird sleep had finally pushed me into a run of bad nights. But that did not explain what happened when I took the truck into the shop a week later. Sleep became a negotiation after that. I started breaking my runs differently, pushing harder while I felt alert, then paying for motel rooms when I could instead of using the sleeper. It cost me, but it was worth the illusion of safety that came with 4 fixed walls and a bed that hundreds of strangers had already survived. On the nights when a motel was not an option and I had to use the bunk, I left a small LED light on, more for psychological comfort than anything else. It did not help much. Twice more I woke to that same weight dipping the mattress, those same soft footsteps on the floor, and once to the distinct sensation of someone exhaling near my ear. Always out of sight. Always gone when I turned. Finally, I booked a longer service appointment in Edmonton. I told myself it was about getting ahead of maintenance. That was partly true. But I also wanted someone else to be inside that cab when I was not. Someone who might notice something wrong that I could not see. The mechanic assigned to my rig was a middle-aged guy who had been around trucks longer than I had been alive. He worked methodically, the way good techs do, running through his checklist, checking the frame, the suspension, the wiring. I hovered more than he probably liked, making small talk to cover the fact that I was waiting for some sign, any sign, that there was a rational explanation hiding in a loose mount or a warped panel. It was when he was checking the sleeper mounts from underneath that he called me over, frowning slightly. "You been hearing any strange noises back there?" he asked, voice muffled from under the chassis. A bolt of cold went through me. I must have hesitated a second too long because he rolled out on the creeper and squinted up at me. "Relax," he said. "I'm not trying to upsell you. There's just something I want you to see." He led me around to the rear of the cab, where the sleeper joined the main structure, and pointed his flashlight along the inside edge of the frame, just above the mudguard. There, in the accumulated dust and road grime, were faint scuff marks. They were not random streaks from debris or tools. They formed a rough pattern, as if something had been pressing and dragging against that section from the inside in repeated arcs. The metal was not bent or damaged, but the marks were too deliberate to ignore. "Could be nothing," he said, sensing my tension. "Maybe something loose inside was rubbing, but it is right in line with the sleeper floor. Weird place for regular wear." He tapped the metal with the handle of his light, listening. "Nothing hollow, though. No rodents, no obvious mechanical reason for it. I will check inside for loose brackets." He did. He found nothing. All the fastenings were tight. The floor was solid. The mounts were secure. After he finished, he shrugged and wrote it off as old scuffing from a previous modification. There was nothing more he could do. Trucks make marks. That is their nature. For him, the incident ended there. For me, those faint arcs felt like the only physical evidence that something had been moving where nothing should. It was as if a pair of bare feet had been shuffling along that narrow floor over and over, leaving traces only where pressure met metal. I still run the Vancouver to Edmonton route. That is my lane, for better or worse. But the relationship I have with my sleeper is not what it was. I no longer think of it as just another cramped little bedroom on wheels. It feels more like a room I share with someone I cannot quite see. Someone who does not care if I know they are there. On bad nights when the fatigue walls close in and I have no choice but to pull off at some dark stretch of road, I lie in the bunk and listen to the truck breathe around me. Every creak is suspect. Every change in weight distribution makes my muscles clench. Sometimes nothing happens at all, and I drift off almost peacefully. Other times, just as I am about to slip under, I feel that familiar gentle sag of the mattress near my legs, as if a quiet presence has settled in again, patient and unhurried. I have stopped asking who it is. There's no answer that would make a difference. All I know is that whatever shares the sleeper with me has never tried to hurt me, never spoken, never done more than remind me in the most intimate way possible that I am not as alone out there as I once believed. And somehow, that is almost worse than anything violent. Violence you can fight, or flee, or heal from. This is just company I never asked for, in a space that used to be mine alone, and now is not. People like to joke that hauling livestock is just babysitting with worse smells, but the truth is running cattle through central Alberta teaches you a lot about timing, routes, and the kind of darkness that settles in the fields after midnight. I have been doing this long enough that the map between Red Deer and Edmonton lives in my muscles. I know which rest stops stay plowed, which back roads wash out first in the spring, and which mile markers mean I should already be slowing down if I do not want half a trailer of panicked animals crashing into the gate. For years, it was all routine. Long hours, noisy cargo, quiet roads. Then I hit mile marker 217 on a night that burned the routine right out of me. It was February, clear and brutally cold, the kind of night where the stars look close enough to touch and your breath freezes to the inside of the glass. The load was nothing special. A group of steers heading up from a farm south of Calgary to a processor outside Edmonton. I had left later than I wanted because the farmer insisted on a second count and a third cup of coffee, and one more story about how things used to be when his dad ran the place. By the time I finally got onto the main highway, the sky had gone from twilight blue to deep black. Traffic thinned quickly once I cleared the city glow. A few southbound plows, a handful of cars that vanished down exit ramps, the occasional fellow rig giving a lazy flash of high beams and greeting. After an hour or so, it was just me, the soft shifting and lowing from the trailer behind me, and the whine of cold air around the cab. The road surface was hard-packed, more frozen gravel than ice, with the kind of grip that makes you feel safer than you probably should. Mile marker 217 is not special on any map. No big intersection, no rest area, just a stretch where the fields pull back a little on one side and the tree line presses closer on the other, like the land could not decide if it wanted to be open or dense. I had passed it 100 times without noticing. That night, it is the only part of the highway I can remember in sharp detail. I saw him before my brain understood what I was seeing. A shape in the beam of my headlights, dead center in the lane, where nothing should be. For half a second, I thought it was a deer or maybe a stray calf that had busted out of somewhere. Then the shape resolved into a person, stumbling, arms loose at his sides, clothes hanging wrong for the temperature. A man in a thin t-shirt and jeans, bareheaded, moving like each step might be his last. The world narrowed to that one point. My foot slammed the brake, muscle memory kicking in even as my heart jumped into my throat. The cattle behind me shifted in a living wave, the trailer giving one hard lurch. I laid on the air horn, the sound tearing out into the night. The man flinched, turned his head just enough for the light to catch his face. His eyes were wide and unfocused, skin so pale it almost glowed against the dark. For a second, I was sure I was going to hit him. There is only so much physics you can fight when you're hauling that much weight, but he stumbled sideways at the last moment, falling to his knees in the narrow strip of shoulder as my rig roared past. I felt the sickening nearness of him in my bones, like a phantom impact that never quite landed. By the time I got the truck fully stopped, I was a good distance up the road. My hands shook as I set the brake and hit the hazards. Every training video, every safety briefing, every story about roadside ambushes flashed through my head, but leaving someone out there in that cold, in that state, was not an option my conscience could live with. I grabbed my heavy coat, my flashlight, and the big mag light that had double duty as a comfort object and a weapon, then climbed down. The air hit me like a fist. My nostrils burned. Frost squeaked under my boots as I walked back along the shoulder, the hazard flashers painting the snow red in a slow pulsing wash. The night felt huge and hollow, no other headlights. No engine noise except my own idling truck. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the open space. "Are you hurt? You need help." The man was still on the ground when I reached him, knees in the snow, hands braced. His breath came in sharp, ragged bursts that plumed in the air, but he was not shivering the way he should have been. He looked like he had run a marathon in summer, not staggered through a field at 40 below. Sweat slicked his hair to his forehead. His bare arms were mottled with goose flesh and something darker, bruises or dirt or both. When I swung the flashlight beam toward his face, he flinched away, throwing up an arm. "Turn that off," he rasped. His voice sounded scraped raw. "Please. Just please." I angled the light down, catching his side profile. He looked young, mid-20s maybe, though fear can peel years off a face. There were red marks around his wrists, angry and fresh, like something had been rubbing there. He kept glancing past me toward the dark beyond the tree line. "You're going to freeze out here," I said, forcing my tone into something calm. "I have a warm cab. I can call an ambulance, or the RCMP, or whoever you need. Where is your vehicle?" He laughed then, a short, broken sound that had nothing happy in it. "They took it," he said. "Took everything. I got out of the container. The others..." His voice trailed off, choked by something he was not ready to say. He dragged his gaze back to me, pupils blown wide. "You have to call the police. There is a farm, a lane off the road. They keep people there. Storage containers. I only got out because the lock was..." He made a vague, trembling gesture, as if his hands could fill in the missing details. Every hair on my arm stood up despite the cold. I have done enough rural runs to know how many little farm lanes and back roads crisscross these fields, invisible from the main highway unless you know exactly where to look. I also know the kind of stories that circulate quietly among drivers about sketchy operations tucked away down those roads, the ones everyone suspects but no one can quite prove. "Okay," I said. "Okay. We will call them, right now, but you need to get out of this cold." I reached for his arm. His muscles jumped under my fingers, but he let me help him to his feet. He swayed, almost going down again, and I slipped an arm around his back to steady him. He was lighter than I expected, the bones too sharp under the thin shirt. We started toward the truck together, my boots crunching, his mostly dragging through the drifted snow. Every few steps he looked over his shoulder, toward the field, toward the place he had come from. I followed his gaze once. The land seemed like any other winter prairie in the middle of the night, flat and white under the spill of my hazards, dark beyond that. The trees on the far side of the ditch stood in a tight cluster, their branches knitted together like fingers. Nothing moved. No lights in the distance, no sign of any lane or road cut through the snow. "They will come looking," he muttered. "When they notice. They always notice." "Who?" I asked. He did not answer. His teeth were chattering now, finally catching up with reality, words shaking apart before they reached his lips. By the time we reached the truck, his steps were barely more than shuffles. I had to half lift him onto the first rung of the steps. Once inside, with the door shut and the heater already blasting, the cab felt almost obscenely warm. I wrapped him in my spare blanket, thrust my travel mug into his hands, then grabbed my phone and dialed emergency. My fingers fumbled the screen once, twice, before muscle memory took over. When the dispatcher picked up, I rattled off the kilometer marker, direction of travel, and a quick version of what had happened. Possible escaped victim. Mentions of a container. Farm property. The operator's voice sharpened. She asked if he was armed, if he was aggressive. I looked at the shaking figure in my passenger seat, drowning in fleece and fear. "No," I said. "He is half frozen and terrified. That is all." She told me to stay put, keep him there, and wait for the RCMP. Units were on their way. I hung up and relayed that much to him. He nodded, eyes unfocused, staring at the dash like he was seeing something else entirely. "They never come this far out," he said softly after a moment, like he was talking to himself. "Nobody hears anything. The containers. The walls sweat in summer. In winter, you just get cold and quiet. They said nobody would ever find us." "How did you get out?" I asked, partly to keep him talking, partly because some stubborn part of my brain still wanted proof that this was not the fever dream it felt like. He shrugged one shoulder under the blanket. "Lock was old, rusted. They did not slam it right. I listened for the truck leaving, the one that brings them supplies. When I was sure they would not hear, I hit it with the chain for the others." His voice cracked. He swallowed. "I just ran. I did not look back. I thought I would die out there, and they would be right, that nobody finds anything in the middle of nowhere. I did not know what to say to that, so I did not try to say anything wise. I gave him water, turned the heat up, and waited for the flashing lights. They took longer than I would have liked. 10, maybe 15 minutes, though it felt like an hour. The blue and red finally strobed across my mirrors, blooming in the night like strange flowers. 2 cruisers and an ambulance pulled in behind me, doors opening, breath steaming from uniformed mouths. I climbed down and met them halfway, answering the same questions again, this time with the surreal addition of seeing it all reflected in their eyes. They took the man's statement. They wrapped him in heavier blankets and loaded him into the ambulance. One of the officers asked if I would be willing to show them exactly where I had seen him, to walk them through the sequence. I agreed. We trod back along the shoulder, our boots leaving a mess of prints near the place where he had fallen. The snow there was churned up, marked by knees and hands, proof that at least that part had been real. Beyond the ditch, the field lay undisturbed. The officer shone his spotlight out over the expanse, the beam cutting across the snow and catching on nothing but drifts and weed stalks. No obvious tracks, no lane carved through, no visible farm lights in the distance. "We will get a unit to sweep the side roads," he said, more to his partner than to me. "See if there are any recent tire marks off the main. Could be a bad break, and a lot of drinking talking. Could be more." He thanked me for stopping, for calling. Took my info. Then they were gone, following their lights back into the dark, chasing a trail down roads I could not see. I finished the run in a daze. The cattle still needed to get where they were going, schedules still existed, but every mile between 217 and the plant felt longer than it should have. I kept seeing that thin t-shirt, those red wrists, that mixture of terror and disbelief on his face when my headlights swept over him instead of rolling by. Over the next few weeks, I watched the news more than usual, checked articles between loads, half expecting a big story about a raided farm, rescued captives, some neat conclusion that would box up the horror and make it feel dealt with. There were a couple of small pieces about a police investigation into a possible rural property being used for illegal confinement, but nothing concrete, no arrests, no press conferences. The whole thing seemed to slip into that category of cases that exist in files and nowhere else. An RCMP contact later told me, quietly, that they had found a burned-out shipping container on an abandoned property a few kilometers off that stretch. No bodies, just signs that people had been kept there and evidence of fire. The ground was too frozen to give up much. No clear owner on record. The man I had picked up disappeared into the system. A victim with no fixed address, no family willing or able to speak. Whatever he had escaped It did not turn into the neat TV story I had been unconsciously waiting for. I still drive past mile marker 217. Work does not bend around one bad night. But I do not do it thoughtlessly anymore. Every time the reflective sign flashes in my headlights, I feel my grip tighten on the wheel. I scan the lane more carefully than I used to, searching for any unexpected shape in the road. Sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I think I see movement near the shoulder, and my heart kicks hard. But it's only a drift, a shadow, a trick of the light. If another figure ever staggers out of the dark there, I do not know whether I will be more afraid of hitting them or of what their presence will mean. Because once you have stopped for one ghost of a person on an empty winter highway and heard what they ran from, the empty fields do not look so empty anymore. The darkness out past the ditch feels less like nothing and more like a curtain that can hide almost anything, as long as nobody is watching closely enough to pull it aside. The first time I saw it, I told myself it had to be a moose. That is what your brain does out here in the north when something big moves at the edge of the light. It reaches for the most ordinary monster it can find and tries to cram the shape into that familiar outline. Moose are dangerous, sure, but they are at least part of the world you understand. What I saw by the gravel pit outside Grande Prairie did not fit into anything I knew, and the harder I tried to make it reasonable, the stranger it became. I had been running night shifts on that contract for about 6 months. The company landed a deal hauling aggregate from a remote pit down a cut line off a secondary highway. Nothing fancy. Just back and forth loads for roadwork that never seemed to end. I like nights, less traffic, fewer supervisors hanging around the yard, more time to let the cab go quiet except for the engine and my thoughts. The pit itself was one of those places you only really see if you work out there. A raw wound in the land, ringed by low berms and half-frozen puddles, with a single portable office trailer squatting near the entrance and a couple of tall floodlights glaring down on the main loading area. That night, the cold had dropped hard, turning the air thin and brittle. The snow that had fallen earlier in the week had been churned into gray slush near town, but out here, it lay in crusted sheets, broken only by tire tracks and the dark exposed gravel. I had already done 2 runs and was heading in for my last load before dawn, headlights bouncing as the rig crawled over the rutted access road. The sky was a low ceiling of cloud. No moon, no stars, just a general dimness pressing down on everything. As I crested the last little rise before the pit proper, my lights washed over the far berm, and something moved. At first, it was just a sense of motion, a shadow shifting against shadows. Then the beam hit it more directly. Something tall and pale stood at the lip of the gravel wall, its outline wrong in a way that made my vision stutter. For a few seconds, I thought it might be a person in light coveralls, maybe one of the loader operators taking a smoke break. But the proportions were off. The legs looked too long, the torso narrow, the head slightly too small for the height. It seemed to be leaning forward at an odd angle, as if peering down into the pit. The truck lurched as I instinctively eased off the throttle. My fingers tightened on the wheel. The engine's rumble filled the cab, sounding suddenly thin against the silence outside. I blinked, expecting the shape to resolve into something boring once my brain caught up. Instead, as I rolled closer, the thing at the edge stepped back out of the direct beam, retreating just enough that only its lower half was caught in the headlights for a moment. That was when I saw the way its legs bent. They hinged not only at the knee but higher up, a second joint that did not belong on anything I had ever seen walk on 2 feet. The angles were too sharp, the movement too smooth, like some kind of nightmare insect stretched into a human silhouette. I could not see its face, only the suggestion of a head turning to track my approach, pale against the darkness, featureless in the glare. My first real thought was that I was looking at some kind of trick of the light, maybe equipment, or a tarp flapping on rebar. I grabbed onto that idea like a lifeline, Gravel pits have all sorts of junk lying around. With the floodlights off in that section and only my truck's beams cutting across, shadows could merge into any shape you wanted if you were tired enough. By the time I rolled down into the main bowl of the pit, the thing had vanished from the berm. I craned my neck, peering up through the windshield as I maneuvered into position, but the upper edge was just dark silhouettes of piled rock against a darker sky. The loader's engine coughed to life near the office trailer, its headlights blinking on. Normal, human things asserting themselves. I told myself not to be an idiot, lined up, and waited while the bucket started dropping tons of aggregate into my trailer, the impact vibrating through the frame. Dust and frozen grit rattled against the metal. The familiar rhythm helped. By the time I pulled forward to even out the load, I had half convinced myself I had seen nothing at all. Then the rocks started to move on their own. It was subtle at first. A few small stones trickling down one of the berm slopes opposite the loader, pattering softly in the cold air. That is nothing unusual. Pits settle all the time. But then more followed. A thin stream of gravel skipping and bouncing in a line that curved around the edge of the site, tracing an invisible path. It was like watching the wake of something heavy dragging just out of sight on the other side of the lip, dislodging debris as it went. The hairs on my arms stood up under my jacket. I watched the moving line of disturbed rock circle partway around the pit before stopping near the area where I had first seen the pale shape. No more stones fell after that. The loader operator, a guy named Vince, who had been working pits longer than I had been driving, did not seem to notice. His bucket rose and fell in its usual rhythm. His cab a dark box behind smeared glass. I wanted to be anywhere but there. But there was nowhere to go until the load was secure and I could get back on the road. I forced my attention to the job, checked the gauge, rolled forward on his signal, and finally got the wave that meant I could ease out. As I climbed the exit ramp, engine straining a little against the weight, curiosity and fear wrestled inside me. At the top, I could not stop myself from flicking my eyes toward the section of berm where the rocks had slid. For a split second, just at the limit of my headlights, I caught a glimpse of something tall, standing utterly still, perfectly balanced on the loose slope. It was turned toward my truck. I could not see details, only the impression of overly long limbs and a head cocked to one side, as if listening. Then the front tires hit a rut. The beam jolted, and when it stabilized again, there was only the raw wall of the pit. The access road back to the highway had never felt longer. I kept expecting to see something in the mirrors, some pale shape pacing the truck along the tree line. Nothing appeared. The forest on either side loomed close, branches forming a kind of tunnel. My hands cramped on the wheel. When I finally broke onto the main road and saw the faint glow of distant town lights on the clouds, I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Tiredness is a funny thing. By the time I got back to the yard, checked in, and parked, my brain had gone back to trying to file the whole experience under weird but explainable. Maybe there had been someone out there, some trespasser or hunter. Maybe my eyes had exaggerated what they saw. Maybe I had been half asleep. It is easier to believe you are the problem than that the world is. It would have stayed half forgotten if it had been a one-off. It was not. Over the next few weeks, little things at the pit started to feel off during night runs. I would be waiting in line and notice, out of the corner of my eye, that the floodlights on one pole were flickering in a steady rhythm that did not match any electrical fault I knew, almost like breathing. Once, as I stepped out to check a strap, a rock bounced off the trailer with more force than a simple slide should have had, like something had thrown it from the darkness beyond the light. Then there were the weight spikes. The pit had installed an in and out scale system. You rolled over the pad empty, hauled your load, then rolled out and got your gross. The numbers are usually predictable once you get a feel for the material. A few times, my outbound weight jumped higher than it should have based on the number of bucket loads. Not by a lot, just enough to make the operator frown at his screen and mutter about calibration. Once, I felt the trailer lurch slightly to one side as if something heavy had pressed against it from the outside, then eased off. When I checked, the gravel surface around the tires was unmarked. Finally, one night, I mentioned it in the break room while we were killing time between hauls. I kept it vague at first, talking about weird shifts and scales acting funny. A couple of the other drivers rolled their eyes and blamed the cold. Vince, though, went quiet, staring into his coffee. "You seen it then," he said after a minute. Not a question. I asked what he meant. He shrugged, not quite meeting my eyes. "Tall thing on the berms. Shows up when it wants. Usually when the fog rolls in or when it has been real still for a while. I figure it lives out in the cut lines or in the bush beyond. Maybe it is just something half wild that got used to the noise. Maybe it is something else." He took a sip, grimaced. "As long as it keeps its distance, I keep mine." I waited for the laugh, the punchline, the admission that he was messing with the newer guy. It did not come. Instead, another operator at the next table grunted and said he had quit doing solo shifts up there after seeing a white stickman thing watching his loader from the tree line one foggy morning. The room fell into that particular kind of silence where everyone is listening harder than they want to admit. I could have walked away from the contract. There are always other pits, other loads. But work is work, and the practical part of me refused to rearrange my life around something I could not prove existed. So I kept going back, kept running nights. I changed small things. I parked the truck closer to the office trailer when I could. I stayed in the cab with the doors locked while waiting, instead of wandering around to stretch my legs. I avoided looking too long at the top of the berms. On my last week before that job ended, I took one final night shift. The air was softer, winter loosening its grip, a thin mist hanging over the site. As I eased into the pit, the loader's lights cut through the haze, turning it into glowing veils. I lined up as usual, trying not to think about what might be watching. As the last bucket dropped, the whole rig shuddered once, hard, like something massive had leaned against the trailer from the outside. The loader operator's cab lights flicked in response, as if he had felt it too. For a second, the world hung still. Then the pressure eased. Gravel that had been perfectly level on top of the load shifted in a slow, unnatural wave, settling into a new pattern without anything visibly touching it. I rolled out without looking back that time. Whatever was out there had made its point. I finished the contract, turned in my pit card, and took highway freight for a while, grateful for the relative normalcy of asphalt and long straight lines. I still think about that place when I pass the turnoff. It looks like any other industrial scar on the landscape, a temporary wound that will eventually fill with water and weeds. But sometimes, on foggy nights, when the tree line blurs and the sky hangs low, I imagine a tall, pale shape standing at the edge of some forgotten pit, watching the empty road and waiting for the next set of headlights to dip into its world. There's a rhythm to the QEII between Edmonton and Calgary that you learn in your bones when you run it long enough. Convoys of semis, clusters of commuters, the odd impatient sports car weaving through like it owns the road. I used to take comfort in that predictability. Even at night, with the sky pressed down low and the pavement glazed with black ice, there was always someone ahead, someone behind, a thin string of headlights stitching the two cities together. The night I met the truck that was not there, that string snapped. It was late December, one of those brittle, clear nights where the stars look like they have been hammered directly into the sky, and the cold makes every surface shine. A storm had rolled through earlier, leaving behind a thin skin of slickness that the plows and sanders were still catching up with. Dispatch had me on a standard run, pallets of consumer junk heading south, the kind of load I could do half asleep. I was not half asleep, though. The road demanded more respect than that. My speed sat a cautious few kilometers under the limit, my hands light but ready on the wheel. Traffic had thinned past Red Deer. A few sets of taillights drifted in the distance, and the glare of oncoming cars came in occasional bursts instead of a constant stream. The CB crackled with the usual chatter. Road conditions, weather, good-natured griping. I listened more than I talked. The tires hummed. The engine's steady thrum settled into the space behind my ribs. For a while, it was almost peaceful. Then I saw the lights behind me. At first, it was nothing. Just the faint bloom of headlights cresting a hill a ways back, the way you see a vehicle's glow long before you can judge its speed. I checked my mirrors, as you do, more out of habit than concern. The lights grew slowly but steadily, until I could make out the unmistakable profile of another semi. High-mounted lamps, broad glare across the lane, that familiar presence of mass moving through the dark. He was closer than I liked, riding my rear quarter instead of giving the usual cushion. I frowned, eased slightly to the right within my lane, giving him the hint that there was a room to pass if he wanted it. He did not. The other truck held position, too tight on my tail for the conditions, his headlights glaring in the mirror in a way that made my eyes ache. I gripped the wheel a little harder and keyed the mic. "Southbound, behind me, you want to either back off or come around," I said, keeping my tone even. "Road is slick enough without playing bumper cars." Static hissed. No answer. The channel, which had been busy a minute before, fell abruptly quiet. I frowned and tried again, this time giving my kilometer marker. Nothing. Either his radio was off or he was ignoring me. I checked the mirror again, ready to be properly irritated. That was when I really looked at his rig. It was an older cab-over style, the kind you do not see much anymore, boxy and high-nosed. The paint looked dark, could have been blue or black, hard to tell in my limited view. What caught my attention was the grille. Right in the center, where there should have been a manufacturer emblem, there was only an empty, jagged space, like something had been ripped off and never replaced. The headlights flickered slightly, not in sync with the bumps in the road, but in a way that seemed almost random, brightening and dimming in a slow, arrhythmic pulse. A prickling started at the base of my neck. I told myself it was just someone running old equipment. Not everyone has the budget for a shiny new rig. As for the flicker, cold can do strange things to electrical systems. I forced my gaze back to the lane ahead, jaw tight, and focused on keeping my own truck steady on the subtle sheen of ice. A few minutes later, the road curved gently to the right. I signaled, shifted into the left lane to pass a slower-moving car, then checked my mirror before moving back. The cab-over was still there, glued to my bumper, close enough now that I could make out more detail. The windshield looked darker than it should have, as if the interior lights were off, and whoever was driving sat in deep shadow. I could not see a silhouette, no hint of movement behind the glass, just a blank, black rectangle. Annoyance warred with unease. Tailgating is dangerous at the best of times. Tonight, it was suicidal. I decided to let him go. I eased off the accelerator, dropping a few more kilometers per hour, expecting him to swing wide and blast past with the petty dominance some drivers enjoy. Instead, his speed dropped with mine, maintaining the exact same too tight distance, like we were linked by an invisible rod. "Fine," I muttered. "You want to play games? Play them back there." I flipped the CB to another channel in case the first had gone dead, tossed out another call. Still nothing. The radio hissed. A faint undercurrent of distant voices, too garbled to make out, but no clear reply. The next sign for a rest area came up. I made a quick decision. If he was going to sit on my bumper, he could do it with me, safely off the main line. I signaled, slid back to the right lane, and took the exit ramp, feeling the trailer tug slightly as the grade shifted. In the mirror, the cab-over followed, lights swinging with mine, still far too close. The rest area was a small one, just a loop off the highway with a couple of picnic shelters, half buried in snow, and a darkened washroom building. No other vehicles. The sodium lights cast their harsh orange glow over the empty parking spaces, turning every bit of frost into glitter. I pulled into the truck section, straightened out, and came to a stop, hazards on. My pulse beat thickly in my ears. I kept my eyes on the mirror, fully expecting the other rig to pull in right behind me. For a beat, his headlights flared bright in the glass, washing out the view. Then, as I watched, they simply went out. Not in the way lights dim when someone turns off the ignition, slowly fading. They blinked off like a switch had been thrown. The reflection of my own taillights glowed in an otherwise empty lane. I twisted in my seat to look out the side window, then craned to see through the back panel. The exit ramp lay bare. The loop of the rest area was empty. No other truck, no receding engine noise, just the soft ticking of my cooling brakes and the wind worrying at the edges of the lot. For a long moment, I sat very still, palms slick on the wheel. Rational explanations lined up like good soldiers. Maybe he had blown past on the main line at the last second. Maybe I had misjudged the angle, and he was parked behind the washroom building, out of sight. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, and the whole thing had been exaggerated by nerves. I killed the engine, climbed down, and walked a slow circle of the lot, breath puffing in short, white bursts. My boots crunched over undisturbed snow. No fresh tire tracks cut through it except my own. The highway hummed in the distance, a low, constant sound. A transport blew by out there, its trailer lights streaking red between the trees. Nothing else. Back in the cab, the quiet felt thicker. I sat with it for a few minutes, radio off now, listening to the faint creaks and sighs of the truck. When I finally turned the key and rolled back onto the ramp, I checked the mirrors twice. 3 times. No sign of the cab over. Just the long, straight ribbon of highway unfolding south. I could have told myself it was a one-time hallucination, a trick of light and fatigue. It would have been easier to believe if it had ended there, but over the next months, stories started to surface in ways I could not ignore. It began in snatches of conversation at truck stops. Someone would mention a weird tailgater with an old cab over. Someone else would chime in about a rig with no emblem and flickering lights that had ridden their bumper in a snowstorm before vanishing near a ramp. One night, parked at a diner off the highway, an older driver with 30 years on the road unfolded a yellowed newspaper clipping from his wallet and laid it on the table between us. The article, dated 2 decades back, described a multi-vehicle pileup on the QEII in whiteout conditions. A cab-over rig had jackknifed on black ice, taking out several cars and another truck with it. The accompanying black and white photo showed the burned-out front of a cab. Even with the damage, the empty space where an emblem should have been was obvious, a dark, jagged hole in the grille. Guy driving it died at the scene, the older driver said quietly. So did a family in one of the cars. People said he was pushing too hard in bad weather. They talked about him on the radio for months. Then, after a while, folks started talking about him again for a different reason. He looked up at me, eyes intent. "I have seen that truck twice since then," he said. "Always at night, always when the road is slick and the visibility is trash. Rides right on your tail like it did with you, never answers the radio. Then it's just gone, like it was never there." I wanted to argue, to demand logbooks, proof, hard data, but all I had was a memory of headlights too close and a rig that disappeared into a stretch of highway that leaves a lot of room for things to vanish without explanation. These days, when the weather turns and the ice sheens over the lanes, I keep an extra eye on my mirrors. Sometimes I see nothing but the honest lights of living drivers, as solid and flawed as I am. Sometimes, though, when the wind howls just right and the snow snakes across the asphalt in thin white ghosts, I will glimpse, way back in the reflection, the boxy outline of a cab over, with a dark hole where its emblem should be. When that happens, I do not key the mic anymore. I do not slow down or speed up for its sake. I keep my hands steady, my eyes on the road, and I tell myself that if there is something out here, forever replaying the last bad decisions it made on a winter night long ago, the best thing I can do is give it room to run its course without dragging me or anyone else into the wreck. There is a particular kind of comfort that comes with sealed loads. With livestock or flatbeds, you are always half responsible for the cargo itself. With containers, especially the ones that come straight off the rail, the job seems simple. You check the seal, you haul the box from point A to point B, and if anyone has a problem with what is inside, it is someone else's mess. At least, that is what I used to think before the night I delivered a container that arrived as empty air. I was working out of a yard on the outskirts of Edmonton then, mostly moving intermodal containers from the rail spur to distribution centers scattered around the industrial parks. Long rectangles of steel stacked 3 high, each with its paperwork and its numbered seal, all part of a system designed to make sure no one touched anything they were not supposed to. It is repetitive work, but there is a comfort in the ritual of it. You back under the box, feel the weight settle onto the frame, lock the pins, sign the form, and roll. That evening, the air had that wet edge that promises freezing rain. Low clouds hunched over the yards, turning the sodium lights into hazy orange halos. The day shift was just finishing as I clocked in, a shuffle of drivers swapping gossip and keys in the cramped dispatch office. My manifest was a standard list, 3 containers, all bound for the same general area on the south side. The third one down was circled in red, which usually meant a rush, but the notes were normal. Medical supplies, it said. High value, direct to warehouse, nothing unusual for a city this size. The box itself did not look like anything special. Faded blue paint, company logo half peeled off, a thin skin of grime from its trip across the country. The seal was intact, a dull metal loop crimped tight through the latch, the number matching the one on my paperwork. As I hooked it up, a young guy in a reflective vest approached, clipboard in hand. I had seen him around the yard a few times, always hovering near the rails, always moving just a little faster than everyone else, like he was keyed up on too much coffee. "Hold up a sec," he said, breath puffing in the cold. "Need to double-check that third load. Dispatch wants a second verification on the seal number." He said it like an inconvenience, like he had been sent to babysit a process that did not need babysitting. I read off the digits, watched him write them down. He leaned in close to squint at the tiny stamped numbers, his gloved fingers brushing the metal. For a second, his hand lingered there, longer than necessary, but I wrote it off as him steadying himself on the icy ground. "Looks good," he said, stepping back with a quick smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "You're good to go." I climbed into the cab, put the exchange out of my mind, and eased the rig out of the yard. The city swallowed me up in its usual way. Lines of headlights, traffic lights cycling, a mix of impatience and fatigue hanging over the roads. The container rode smooth and steady behind me, heavy enough that I could feel the inertia in the turns, but not so loaded that the truck felt sluggish. Just another box, just another run. The warehouse sat at the back of one of those sprawling industrial complexes where every building looks like a clone of the one beside it. Wide bay doors, security lights, a patchwork of tire tracks in the snow. I backed into the assigned dock, feeling the familiar thump as the trailer met the bumpers. Inside, a receiver in a high-vis jacket met me with a scanner and a polite nod. We went through the usual dance, confirmed the container number, confirmed the seal number, signed the electronic pad. "Been waiting on this one," he said, more to himself than to me. "They have people lined up to break it down." I stepped aside as he snapped a photo of the seal for their records. He reached up, cutters in hand, ready to slice through the metal. Then he froze. "This is weird," he muttered, frowning. "Feels loose." He wiggled the seal gently, then gave a sharper tug. The loop came away in his hand without resistance, ends still crimped together. There was no break, no obvious tampering. It looked like it had never been closed around the latch at all, even though I had watched him twist it just moments ago for the photo. "You saw that, right?" he asked, looking at me with a sudden tightness around his eyes. "Yeah," I said slowly. "It was through the hasp when we left the yard. I read the number off it." He checked the latch itself. It hung free, No secondary lock in place. For a second, we both just stood there with the metal ring between us, the absurdity of it pushing back against the creeping wrongness. Then he shook himself and swung the doors open. The inside of the container gaped back at us, hollow and echoing. No stacked pallets wrapped in plastic. No boxes, no crates, no loose debris. Just bare steel walls and a scuffed floor marked only by a thin layer of dust that caught the overhead lights. The air that spilled out was dry and cold, smelling faintly of metal and old air, the way empty spaces sometimes do when they have been shut for too long. The receiver turned to look at me, as if I might somehow produce 20 tons of cargo from out of thin air. I stared back at him, then at the yawning emptiness. My mind flicked through possibilities, each one less satisfying than the last. Wrong container, mislabeled paperwork, load stolen at the yard. None of them fit with the intact seal in his hand or the weight I had felt on the drive over. "We waited in," I said, hearing the defensive note in my own voice. "At the yard. It was loaded." He nodded, already pulling out his radio, the professional mask sliding over his features. "Dispatch, we have a problem on Dock 3, he said. "Container arrived sealed and empty. I need a supervisor and someone to pull the inbound scale tickets." What followed was the kind of procedural chaos you only see when something has gone wrong in a system that is not supposed to fail. Supervisors appeared. Clipboards multiplied. Someone took my statement while someone else took photos of the empty interior from every angle, as if more pictures might somehow fill it. They pulled the scale records. The number was clear. The container had rolled out of the yard at a weight consistent with a full load. Somewhere between there and here, all of that mass had vanished, leaving steel and air. The simple explanation, the one everyone wanted to be true, was that the box had been empty all along and the scale reading was bad. But the container had come straight from the rail. The yard kept logs. The rail company kept logs. The numbers lined up too well to be one random glitch. That was when talk of tampering started. Accusations ripple through a place like that faster than any truck can roll. Drivers talked about thieves with specialized tools, about how easy it supposedly was to bypass a seal without leaving a mark if you knew what you were doing. Yard workers muttered about inside jobs. Management people in pressed shirts and stiff jackets arrived to ask the same questions in slightly different ways. At some point, someone asked me to walk them through my route turn by turn, every stop, every slowdown, every set of red lights. I told them the truth. I had gone straight from the yard to the warehouse. No detours, no unexplained pauses. Dashcam footage later backed me up. The container rode steady and unmolested for the entire trip. No one shadowed the truck. No one approached it at the few stops I made. The box that had rolled out full had arrived empty without anyone touching it in any way we could see. A week later, another driver came back white-faced from a run to a different warehouse across town. Different container, different customer, same result. Intact seal, empty box, scale data that said there had been weight that now was not there. People started joking about haunted freight, about someone shipping ghosts. The laughter was thin, security was tightened. Cameras were checked and double-checked. Yard access logs were scrutinized. That was when a pattern emerged. On each of the nights when one of the vanishing loads had left, someone had done an extra visual verification of the seal numbers. Always a different driver. Always a different destination. But the person holding the clipboard, the one with the reflective vest and the too quick smile, was the same. When they went to pull his personnel file, there was nothing. No full name that matched the timesheets. No hiring paperwork. The sign-in logs had his first name scribbled in with a dozen different last initials. On the camera feeds from those nights, his face was either turned away from the lens or blurred by motion. A smudge of a man who had somehow moved through all the cracks. By the time anyone realized that, he was gone. Stopped showing up at shift change, phone disconnected. Whatever he had done, or not done, depending on how you wanted to frame the impossibility, stayed with the empty containers and the angry clients and the long reports that led nowhere. Officially, nothing was ever proven. Unofficially, everyone agreed on 2 points. First, something very valuable had been inside those boxes before they rolled out. Second, whoever had taken it had done so in a way that used every blind spot in the system. The trust in seals, the gaps in camera coverage, the complacency of people like me who believed that once a door was shut and stamped and logged, its contents were beyond our concern. I changed carriers a few months after that. It was not just because of the incident, but that was part of it. The comfort I had taken in sealed loads was gone. Every time I backed under a container, I found myself wondering what was really inside and whether it would still be there when I reached the other end. I started double-checking seals, not because I thought I could catch whatever trick had been used, but because not checking felt like inviting the same vanishing act to happen again. Even now, when a receiver cuts a seal and swings open a pair of steel doors, there's always a small, irrational part of me that braces for the echoing hollow instead of stacked cargo. Most of the time, reality behaves. The space is full of what the paperwork says it should hold. On the rare occasions when I hear about a load that arrived wrong, weight off by more than a rounding error, my mind goes back to that first empty container and the moment when space itself seemed to have swallowed something whole between 2 fixed points on a map. People will tell you that freight is simple, that it is just numbers and routes and metal and fuel, but out on the fringes of the yards, under the sodium lights and the low clouds, or it can start to feel like there are other economies at work. Moving things no manifest ever lists. Shifting weight no scale can register. And sometimes, when you are the one sitting behind the wheel, you realize you are not just hauling cargo. You are driving the line where things appear and disappear, last person to see something that should not be able to vanish, but somehow did. The first time I heard the voice on Channel 19 use my name, I almost drove off the road. I had been driving long enough by then to know that the CB can feel like a lifeline. You spend hours boxed in by darkness, lights from oncoming traffic smearing past, and that scratchy chatter becomes your only proof that the rest of the world has not fallen away. Most of it is nonsense. Weather, road conditions, jokes that would get you fired anywhere else. But every so often, someone actually saves your skin with a heads up about a blown tire or a wreck over the next hill. That was what I told myself the night east of Red Deer when the voice cut through the static and said, as clear as if he was sitting in my passenger seat, "Haley, you need to slow down before you hit that ice at the marker." I had not given my name. It was late, the kind of late when the clock's numbers stop meaning much. A storm had rolled through earlier, left behind dirty snow piled on the shoulders, and streaks of black ice that caught your tires if you were careless. I was running solo, heading south with a mostly empty trailer, which is one of the worst combinations for winter driving. Too light to grip properly, too heavy to catch once it started to go. The radio was on out of habit, Channel 19 humming with occasional burst of conversation. I was thinking about coffee and the warmth of the next truck stop, not about ghosts or glitches, when the channel went dead silent for a beat. Then a man's voice slid in, smooth and calm, pitched low enough that it did not crackle. Southbound in the blue tractor, with the faded logo, "Haley, drop about 10 and take the right lane. Black ice just past marker 183. I froze. My rig did fit that description. I'd not mentioned where I was or what I was driving. I'd not been on the air in at least half an hour. Reflex took over before fear did, at least. My foot eased off the throttle. The speedometer needle crept down. I signaled and shifted to the right lane, more because the certainty in that voice made my body move than because I fully believed him. 20 seconds later, my headlights swept over a patch of the highway that looked no different from the rest. Maybe a little shinier. Maybe I only thought that after the fact. The steering wheel went light in my hands. For 2 long heartbeats, the entire truck felt like it was floating. The back end began to slide just enough that instinct screamed it was about to come around. I did what they teach you. No sudden brakes, no overcorrection. I let the rig ride it out, nudged the wheel gently, breathed through clenched teeth. The tires bit back into real grip, and the weight settled under me again. I exhaled a shaky laugh that sounded nothing like amusement. "Nice save," the voice on the CB said, in that same even tone. "Seen worse there. You will be clear after the next bridge." I grabbed the mic before my brain had a chance to decide if that was a good idea. "Who is this?" I demanded. "How did you know my name?" There was a brief hiss, then nothing. The channel filled again with irregular noise. Some guy northbound complaining about his dispatch, another calling out a speed trap near a rest area. No one acknowledged what had just happened. When I asked again more cautiously if anyone had warned me about the ice back there, the answers were confused. "Negative, ma'am, not me. Just tuned in." "Did not catch that, repeat." Someone joked about me talking to myself. Nobody said, "Oh, that was so-and-so, he always helps the newbies." The hair on my arms stayed raised all the way to the next stop. At the fuel island, under the bright fluorescence and the smell of exhaust and fried food, it was easier to rationalize. Maybe I had missed a call-out. Maybe someone had used my name earlier and I had forgotten. Maybe there was another Haley on the road that night with a blue tractor, and I had just benefited from her guardian angel. The mind will do backflips to make the world less strange. I might have forgotten it if it had ended there. It did not. The second time, there was no ice. There was something worse. It was a few weeks later, middle of the night again, same general corridor. The kind of clear, bitter cold that makes the stars feel too sharp. Wind knifing across open fields and rocking the cab just enough to keep you from getting complacent. The CB had been quiet for a while, most of the usual chatter gone to bed. I had the volume turned low, background noise to keep me company while the kilometers unspooled. "Haley," the voice said, and this time my fingers clenched on the wheel so hard that my knuckles ached. "There is a 4-wheeler spun out in the median just past marker 209. He is going to try to pull back onto the road in front of you. Take the left lane and give him space. He does not see you." I should have ignored it. I should have demanded a name, a location, some proof that this was not just someone screwing with me. Instead, my body remembered the feel of the truck sliding on invisible ice and made the decision on its own. Signal, mirror, left lane. The markers whipped by. 198, 201, 205. I started to feel stupid. Then my headlights painted the scene just outside the beam's reach. A sedan nose down in the median, rear wheels spinning in the air, exhaust smoking into the cold. A man stood beside it, phone pressed to his ear, shoulders hunched. As I approached, he made a sudden panic decision. He jumped back into the car, tires flinging snow as he cranked the steering wheel and tried to muscle the vehicle back onto the right lane. If I had been there, if I had been in that lane doing the speed I had been, there would have been nowhere for either of us to go. Instead, I rolled past in the left, horn blaring once more out of reflex, then hope he would hear it over his own engine. In the mirror, I saw his car fishtail, jerk, then settle half on the shoulder. He had no idea how close he had come to being shredded under my trailer. My heart pounded so hard that I felt slightly nauseous. I reached for the mic, thumb hovering over the button, then stopped. I did not want to hear that voice again, not while adrenaline still roared in my ears. I turned the volume down until the radio was barely a whisper and drove in silence for a while. It would have been easy enough to ask around at the next stop to see if anyone knew a driver with a smooth baritone who liked playing Highway Guardian. Instead, I kept my mouth shut. The whole thing felt too unreal. Like saying it out loud would turn it into a story instead of something that had actually kept me from killing a stranger. Of course, stories have a way of finding you anyway. A few nights later, I was at a small truck stop cafe, halfway through a plate of poutine that had no right to be as good as it was, when one of the older drivers slid onto the bench across from me without asking. I had seen him around, a quiet guy with a weather-beaten face and hands that looked like they had done their share of work long before he ever climbed into a cab. "You've heard him then," he said, not bothering with small talk. I blinked. "Heard who?" "The voice," he said. "On 19. Calls you by name. Tells you what is in front of you before you get there." The fry in my mouth turned to paste. I swallowed with an effort. "You too?" I asked. He nodded, eyes distant for a moment. "First time was 98, I think. Winter like this. There was a bad wreck near the old overpass. Pileup that took out half a dozen vehicles, 2 rigs, whiteout, black ice, you name it. One driver kept calling out positions on the radio, trying to talk people through the mess. He stayed on the air until his line went dead. People said he died in the crush." He stirred his coffee, watching the swirl of cream like it might shape itself into a map. After that, every once in a while, someone would hear a voice on 19, calm, like he had all the time in the world. He would warn about things right before they happened. Wrong-way drivers, sudden fog banks, ice you could not see. Always seemed to know the caller's name. Never answered when you asked his, then he would be gone. I told him, carefully skirting the details that felt too raw, about the ice and the spun-out car. He listened without interrupting, just nodding slowly. "Sounds like him," he said when I finished. "Or what is left. Whatever that means." "So you think—" I hesitated, feeling foolish even as I said it. "What?" "That a dead driver is out here running interference for the rest of us." He gave a small shrug. "I think there are a lot of names on crosses along these highways," he said. "Some people go quick. Some do not know they are gone. Maybe he is stuck in that one night, running down the list of all the ways things can go bad, trying to make it different for someone else." He looked up, meeting my gaze. Or maybe it is just some guy with a good scanner and too much time. "Does not matter much, does it, if you get to go home?" That was easy enough logic to accept in a warm diner with other rigs idling under the lights outside. Harder on an empty stretch of road at 3 in the morning. The third time he came through, I was running west toward the foothills, snow blowing in thin snakes across the asphalt. Visibility not terrible, but not great. The radio had been a steady presence all night, other drivers checking in about chain-up spots and drifting drifts. Then, just like before, silence pressed in for a moment. That same voice slipped under my skin. "Haley," he said, "there's going to be a breakdown just past the next rise. Left lane blocked. Slow it up. Keep right. You do not want to be part of what is coming." My stomach nodded. I reached for the dial, turned the volume all the way down until the channel was a faint hiss. For a few seconds, I contemplated ignoring him. There is a stubborn streak in me that does not like the idea of anyone, living or dead or imaginary, tugging on my strings. Then I pictured the sedan in the median, the feeling of the truck floating on ice, the way my name had sounded on his tongue, not mocking, not demanding, just certain. I eased off the throttle. The rise came up, a long, gentle curve. As I crested it, my headlights found a mess of lights ahead, red and amber and white, strobing weirdly through the falling snow. A rig sat jackknifed across the left lane, its trailer skewed at an ugly angle. A pickup was sideways in front of it, nose crumpled. A few figures in reflective gear moved cautiously along the shoulder, waving oncoming traffic to the right. Because I was already slowing, already expecting something, I had the space I needed to brake without sliding, to signal and merge past where responders gestured. If I had come over that rise at full speed, with no warning, I would have been one more uncontrolled mass on an ice-slick hill. I did not turn the radio back up until I was well clear. When I did, whatever gap he had slipped through had closed. The channel was full of regular drivers again, cursing the conditions, telling each other to take it easy. I've not heard him often since. maybe 3 or 4 times in total. Enough that I know it is not something my mind invented to give shape to intuition. The warnings are always specific, always tied to some immediate danger, and always right. Once, he told me to skip a particular rest area because the guy in the van there is not sleeping. A week later, I heard about an attempted robbery in that same lot. I do not pretend to understand it. Maybe there is a logical explanation involving scanners and hacked GPS, and a very weird sense of humor. Maybe there is not. What I know is this. When the channel goes quiet in that particular way, and that voice slips through the static, saying my name like he has known it for years, I listen. I still drive nights. The road is what I have, and I'm not ready to give it up. But the loneliness feels different now. There is something unnerving about knowing that there might be a presence out there monitoring the same dark stretches I am, seeing hazards before I do, calling them out in a tone that never quite loses its edge of strain. It feels less like company and more like someone pressed against glass on the other side of a moment they cannot escape, trying to warn the rest of us away from the crash they never walked away from. So when he speaks, I adjust my speed, change lanes, avoid the places he tells me to avoid. And when the miles pass without his voice, I do what every driver does in the quiet. I watch the road, I mind the weather, and I try not to think too hard about how thin the line can be between the ones talking on the radio and the ones who have become nothing but a voice in someone else's cab in the middle of the night. There are certain rest areas along the secondary highways in rural Alberta that you learn to trust without thinking about it. They are small, usually nothing more than a washroom block and a couple of parking spaces, but they are reliable. Lights work most of the time. The doors lock from the inside. You can grab a few hours of sleep without worrying too much. The one off Highway 27, about halfway between nowhere and somewhere, was one of mine. I had stopped there dozens of times over the years, always grateful for the chance to stretch my legs and shake off the road haze. It was old, sure, with paint peeling from the concrete walls and a vending machine that had not worked since the previous decade, but it felt safe in the way familiar things do. That feeling died one February night when I wandered through a door I was never supposed to see. The cold that night had teeth, the kind that bites through layers and makes your joints ache before you even step outside. I had been running a long haul for Medicine Hat, one of those jobs where the hours blur together and you start counting rest stops instead of kilometers. By the time I rolled into the lot, my back was screaming and my eyes felt like someone had rubbed sand into them. 2 other rigs sat dark at the far end, their drivers long asleep. The sodium lights buzzed overhead, casting that sickly orange glow that turns everything the color of old bruises. I killed the engine, grabbed my coat, and headed for the washroom. The wind cut across the lot in sharp gusts, carrying little pellets of ice that stung when they hit exposed skin. The door to the main building stuck the way it always did, and I shouldered it open with the practiced shove of someone who had done this dance before. Inside, the air was warmer but stale, tinged with the smell of industrial cleaner and something faintly metallic. The lights flickered once, hummed, then steadied. I used the facilities, splashed cold water on my face that did not help as much as I hoped, and was halfway to the exit when I noticed the side door. It sat at the far end of the narrow hallway, just past the janitor's closet. I had been in that building more times than I could count, and never once registered that door. The paint was newer than the rest of the walls, a clean gray that did not match the chipped beige elsewhere. No sign, no label. Just a plain steel door with a brushed metal handle. Curiosity is a dangerous thing when you are tired. Logic says, leave it alone. Exhaustion says, maybe there is a warmer room, a place employees use, somewhere I could sit for a few minutes out of the wind. I reached for the handle. It turned smoothly. No resistance. The door swung inward on silent hinges, and a wave of warm air rolled out, thick and chemical smelling. Beyond it, concrete steps led down into a basement I had no idea existed. A single bare bulb lit the top of the stairs, casting a weak yellow pool that did not reach the bottom. Part of me knew this was wrong. Rest areas like this one do not have basements. They are bare bones, structures slapped onto gravel pads, built for function and nothing more. But the warmth drew me, and the exhaustion dulled the part of my brain that should have been screaming warnings. I descended. The stairs were steep and narrow, walls close enough to brush my shoulders. At the bottom, the space opened into a low-ceilinged room lit by more bare bulbs strung along exposed wiring. The air was oppressively warm now, humid in a way that made my skin feel sticky. A low hum vibrated through the floor, machinery of some kind running out of sight. What I saw made my stomach clench. A metal table sat in the center of the room, bolted to the concrete. The surface was clean, too clean, reflecting the overhead lights with a dull sheen that spoke of recent scrubbing. Leather restraints hung from its sides, buckles undone, dangling like dead things. Along the far wall, shelves held plastic containers filled with liquids that ranged from clear to rust-colored. Labels were scrawled in handwriting I could not read from that distance. The metallic smell was stronger here, cutting through the humidity. Underneath it, something else. Sweat, maybe, or fear, if fear had a smell. The kind of wrongness that burrows into your hindbrain and sets off every alarm evolution gave you. I heard voices then, muffled, coming from somewhere deeper in the complex. A sharp laugh, the scrape of something heavy being dragged. Footsteps approaching. Panic hit like ice water. I turned and took the stairs 2 at a time, lungs burning, every muscle suddenly flooded with adrenaline. I did not look back. I hit the door at the top hard enough that it banged against the wall, stumbled into the hallway, and kept moving. Through the main door, out into the freezing lot, the wind now a blessing because it meant I was outside, away, in a world that made sense. I climbed into my cab, locked the doors, and sat there shaking for a long time. The other 2 rigs at the far end of the lot remained dark and silent. Nothing stirred in the rest area. The building sat under its buzzing lights, as ordinary and unremarkable as it had been when I arrived. I did not sleep that night. I sat with the engine idling, heater on, every sense tuned to the building across the lot. Part of me wanted to call the police, to report what I had seen. The other part kept asking what exactly I would say. That I found an unlocked door and a creepy basement. That there were restraints on a table. For all I knew, it was some kind of maintenance setup I did not understand. Or storage for equipment I had no context for, except I knew. Deep in the part of me that still listened to instinct over logic, I knew that room was not for fixing pipes or storing supplies. When dawn finally bled gray light across the horizon, I left. I did not use that rest area again for weeks, choosing instead to push through to the next town, or pull off onto the shoulder when I absolutely had to stop. Eventually, work and exhaustion wore down my resistance. I told myself I had overreacted, that fear and fatigue had twisted something mundane into a nightmare. Then the news broke. It was a small article buried in the back of a regional paper I picked up at a truck stop. Human trafficking investigation, rural rest area, anonymous tip, RCMP raid, multiple missing persons. The location was vague, just a reference to a highway corridor in central Alberta. But the details matched: an underground space, evidence of confinement, connections to a network that had been operating quietly for years, using facilities in plain sight that no one thought to question. I sat in my cab with that paper spread across the steering wheel, hands shaking again. The article did not name the exact rest area. It did not have to. I knew. What haunted me most was not what I had seen. It was the timing. How many nights had I stopped there, used that washroom, walked those same halls, never noticing that door? How many other drivers had done the same, oblivious to what lay beneath their feet? And if that maintenance worker had not propped the wrong door open that night, If I had not wandered down those stairs out of tired curiosity, would anyone have ever called it in? The article mentioned that no one had been in the facility at the time of the raid. Whoever had been using it had cleared out, tipped off, or simply lucky. The investigation was ongoing, they said, but leads were thin. I considered coming forward, adding my account to the file. In the end, I did not. What could I add that the physical evidence had not already shown? And some part of me, cowardly or practical, depending on how you frame it, did not want to be the face attached to that story. Did not want whoever had been using that room to have a name and a route to trace back. I still stop at rest areas. There is no avoiding it in this job. But I do not wander anymore. I use the facilities, I leave, and I keep my curiosity on a short leash. The world is full of doors that are not meant to be opened, and sometimes the only thing separating you from what is behind them is the accident of a tired moment and a choice to look where you should not. On the nights when I pass that particular stretch of highway, I see the rest area lights in the distance and feel my chest tighten. Sometimes there are rigs parked there, drivers sleeping soundly, unaware of the history beneath the concrete. I do not stop to warn them. What would I say? That once in that building something terrible happened? That it might happen again? Instead, I keep my hands on the wheel, my eyes on the road, and I drive past. The only difference now is that I check my mirrors more than I used to, scanning not just for traffic, but for the unmarked vans I sometimes see, idling in the lots. The ones that do not belong to any company I recognize. And when I see them, I make a note, log the plate if I can, and keep moving. It is a small thing, probably meaningless, but after what I stumbled into that night, it is the only way I know how to keep driving these roads without feeling like I am complicit in the silence that lets places like that exist in the first place. The trucking yard on Edmonton's south side was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. We parked in the same spots every night, left our rigs lined up like sleeping animals under the security lights, and trusted that nothing would happen because nothing ever did. It was not fancy. The pavement was cracked, the fence sagged in places, and the office trailer looked like it had been there since before I was born. But it was ours. It was safe. Or at least, that is what we all believed until the morning Carter's rig burned. I had been working out of that yard for almost 3 years by then, running regional routes that kept me close enough to sleep in my own bed a few nights a week. The routine was predictable in a way I had come to appreciate. Clock in, check the board, grab your keys, roll out. Most nights, I would pull back in after dark, park in my usual spot near the back fence, lock up, and head home. The yard sat quiet overnight, just rows of trucks and the occasional security patrol that may or may not have actually been awake. That particular morning, I arrived earlier than usual, the sky still caught between night and dawn, the kind of purple-gray that makes everything look unfinished. I turned onto the access road and immediately saw the emergency vehicles. Fire trucks, ambulance, 2 police cruisers, all clustered near the northwest corner, where the older rigs usually parked. Red and blue lights strobed across the metal siding of the nearby warehouse, turning the scene into something out of a bad dream. My stomach dropped before my brain even processed what I was looking at. I parked outside the gate and walked in, showing my ID to the officer who stopped me at the entrance. He checked his list, nodded, and waved me through, his face professionally blank in that way cops have when they are done being surprised by anything. The burned rig sat in a pool of water and foam, still smoking faintly. The cab was a twisted black skeleton, metal, warped, and paint blistered away, windows blown out. The acrid stench of melted plastic and scorched rubber hung thick in the cold air, strong enough to taste. I recognized the truck by its position more than anything else. It had been Carter's. He ran the same kinds of jobs I did, always friendly in a quiet way, the kind of guy who kept his head down and did the work. One of the yard supervisors stood near the perimeter, arms crossed, staring at the wreck like it might offer an explanation if he looked hard enough. I approached carefully, not sure if I was supposed to be there or if I would be told to leave. "What happened?" I asked. He glanced over, recognized me, and shrugged with the kind of weariness that comes from a night spent answering the same question. "Fire started around 4 this morning. Carter was sleeping in the cab. Honking woke up a couple of the other guys, but by the time anyone got close enough, the whole thing was going up. They could not get him out." His voice was flat, carefully stripped of anything that might crack. "Happened fast. Real fast." I felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Carter slept in his cab sometimes when he had an early run and did not want to drive home just to turn around a few hours later. A lot of us did. The idea that something could go from normal to fatal in the span of a few minutes, while you were locked inside a steel box, made every nerve in my body go tight. "How did it start?" I asked, though part of me did not want to know. He shook his head. "That is what they are trying to figure out. Fire investigators said it looked like it started inside the cab, but the rig was not running. Engine was cold when they got here. No obvious accelerant, no sign someone torched it from outside. They are calling it suspicious." The word hung in the air like smoke. Suspicious. Not an accident. Not bad wiring or a heater malfunction. Something deliberate. Over the next few hours, more of the regular drivers filtered in, drawn by word, spreading fast the way bad news always does. We stood in clusters, talking in low voices, trying to piece together what little we knew. Someone mentioned that Carter had been fighting with dispatch over a string of loads that came up short, money missing from his pay. Someone else said he had been asking questions about off-the-books freight, implying someone higher up was skimming. The stories multiplied, contradicted, and circled back on themselves. Nobody knew for sure. What we did know was that Carter had made noise about something, and now Carter was dead. The police took statements from anyone who had been in the yard that night. I had not been, so they just logged my name and contact info in case they needed to follow up later. One of the officers mentioned, almost offhand, that they were looking at security footage. The yard had a few cameras scattered around, low-resolution relics that barely worked half the time, but maybe they caught something. A week passed. The burned hull of Carter's truck was towed away, leaving a black stain on the pavement that no amount of scrubbing seemed to erase. The spot stayed empty. Nobody wanted to park there. The investigation dragged on in that quiet, bureaucratic way that tells you nothing is moving fast. Then the rumors started. Drivers began leaving. Not all at once, but in a slow trickle that nobody wanted to acknowledge out loud. A guy who had been there for 5 years suddenly took a job with a competitor across town. Another just stopped showing up. No explanation, no goodbye. The ones who stayed started acting differently, more cautious, less willing to joke around or talk about anything that was not directly related to the next load. I caught wind of the real story in pieces stitched together from overheard conversations and things people would only say after a couple of beers when their guard was down. Carter had not just been complaining about missing pay. He had kept records, photos of manifests, weight tickets, times and dates that did not line up. He was building a case that someone in the office was falsifying logs and pocketing the difference, using drivers like us as cover. Whoever it was had found out. Maybe they confronted him. Maybe they just decided the risk was not worth leaving him around to talk. The fire investigator eventually released a report. Delayed ignition device, they said, wired into the truck's electrical system in a way that made it look like a failure until you knew exactly what to look for. Set to go off hours after it was installed, giving whoever planted it plenty of time to be far away. Professional work, or close enough to it. The kind of thing that requires knowledge and access. No arrests were made. The company issued a statement about cooperating fully with authorities, tightened security protocols that mostly involved more cameras nobody believed would help, and quietly settled with Carter's family. A few people in the office stopped coming to work. Transfers, they said. Restructuring. The kind of vague language that means someone got shuffled sideways to avoid the spotlight. The yard felt different after that. Smaller somehow, like the space itself had contracted. Drivers who used to sleep in their cabs started going home, no matter how inconvenient. Parking spots near the office became more desirable than the ones in the back. People checked under their rigs before starting them, shining flashlights along the undercarriage and into the wheel wells, looking for things they would not know how to identify even if they found them. I started doing it too. Every time I came back to the yard, before I climbed into the cab, I would walk a slow circle around the truck, crouch down, look for wires that should not be there, for anything that seemed out of place. I did not know what I was looking for, not really, but the ritual felt necessary, a way of asserting control over a situation that had proven how little control any of us actually had. One night, about a month after the fire, I was finishing my check when I noticed something small wedged into the gap near the battery housing. A thin piece of wire, stripped at one end, curled around a bolt. It could have been debris, could have been something left over from routine maintenance, but it was not there the day before. I was sure of that. I did not touch it. I backed away slowly, pulled out my phone, and called the yard supervisor. He came out with a flashlight and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he called someone else. By the time the mechanic arrived and carefully extracted the wire, a small crowd had gathered, silent and tense. The mechanic turned it over in his gloved hands, frowned, and said it was probably nothing, probably fell in from somewhere. Nobody believed him. Nobody said so out loud. But you could see it in the way people avoided eye contact, the way conversations died when I walked past. After that night, 3 more drivers quit. I thought about joining them, but jobs are not easy to come by, and starting over, somewhere else, felt like admitting defeat to whoever had decided Carter's questions were too dangerous to leave unanswered. Instead, I changed my habits. I stopped parking in the same spot every night. I varied my routes home. I kept copies of every piece of paperwork, every load sheet, every email, stored somewhere off-site where no one could disappear it quietly. It felt paranoid. It felt necessary. The black stain on the pavement where Carter died is still there, faded now but visible if you know where to look. The company painted new lines around it, reorganized the lot layout, tried to make it blend in. It does not work. Every time I walk past that spot, I feel the weight of it. A reminder that some questions have answers people will kill to protect, and that the line between a workplace and a crime scene can be thinner than anyone wants to believe. I still work out of that yard. The pay is decent, the routes are familiar, and leaving would not change what happened. But I do not sleep in my cab anymore, no matter how early the call time. I do not ask too many questions about loads that seem off, and every time I turn the key in the ignition, there is a half second where I hold my breath, waiting to see if the engine starts clean, or if this is the morning someone decided I had become the next problem that needed solving. So far, it has always started. So far, I have been lucky. But luck is not a plan. And every driver who was there the morning Carter's rig burned knows that luck is a resource that eventually runs out.